Hey Al, how y'all doing? Let me rephrase. I would love it if one of you or more could unmute so I could see if I can hear anything with my headphones on.
Hello.
Good.
Doing good.
Okay, that is not successful. Let me switch to a different thing. Pa-pa-pa-pum-pum. Speakers there. Can you unmute again and try it again?
How you doing?
Hello.
That works. So what I'm learning, I guess, is just don't even bother with the headphones. Okay, so hopefully your day is going well. Mine is going okay, other than that. So we're in good shape. Let's start up with I'll just do the sort of thing that will allow us to be all on the same page, and then we'll move forward. It looks like we are recording, and that's something I was going to mention in a second, but let me just go ahead and share a whole screen. Boom. Should be sharing that. Yeah, excellent. And so now you can see what I'm seeing, and that is the Canvas page for the class. What I wanted to do is really sort of walk through just a couple things on that, so that way we're all comfortable and know what the expectations are and all that good stuff. And if you have questions, well, we can work that out. Okay. And so I love it when people interrupt me with questions as we go. I guess I am going to turn on the chat function but I often will not see if you just type a question in chat. So just please unmute and do the thing that you know how to do. Okay, so let's think. On the front page, here we go. Classes are click the link, you show up here. Thumb up. Number two is there is a syllabus. I'll talk about that. Actually, I'll talk about that after I get through some of the other things. Office hours, they're at certain times on Mondays and Wednesdays. They're between the two classes I have. I've got a noon to one, so right after that one, and then right before this one. Tuesdays and Thursdays, it's before the first class and then after this class. And so at a different Zoom link. And so you might need to jump out and then sort of jump into another location. So again, Mondays and Wednesdays between the two classes, Tuesdays and Thursdays outside of the window that my two classes are in. And then if you want another day or time, just click the link. In theory, this should work. Let's just see if it does. We opened certainly a new window of some sort. Oh, it's Calendly. I love Calendly. So supposing on Wednesday I wanted to meet up with my instructor named Steve, I could click sure 2 o'clock, and then that should magically lead you through into making an appointment. And I tried to keep my calendar update in such a way that it sort of blocks out the time blocks on Calendly, which I become unavailable. So just letting you know, I'll add those things. And so hopefully there is no conflict, but if there is, I would email you back saying, it's not going to work. And I'll tell you why. We've got a text for the class, the third edition of DeVore, Farnham, and Doy. Let me look out the window. Oh, can't quite see it here. Primary author Jay DeVore lives a quarter mile up the hill from me. Yay. None of you met him, I'm sure. Jimmy Doy in our department is the third author, and he came in for the third edition of our book. I like the book. I'm happy with it. Hopefully you'll like it too. If you're the sort that says, you know what? I want to hear that again. What you can always do is go to I think it's 2 or 3 years ago. Oh, 2 years ago. You can click your way into the different days. I didn't really list the topic for the day in the playlist formally, but we'll see in a little bit that that is solved. There are exams for y'all to take. The dates, I've forgotten exactly what they are, but the final is on campus, July 23rd, 4 to 6. And there's always one or two people who say, but hold on. I'm living in Argentina, or last 2 years ago it was Kazakhstan or something. And so we can work things out, but the department took a vote that says pretty much there has to be a physical proctor that we can hunt down and verify that there was no cheating involved in class, in the room. At Cal Poly is the easiest way to go. But if you happen to be right near the University of Maryland, you might be able to walk over and say, could you just help me out here? And they might be able to charge you a fee and say, yeah, we got you covered. Okay. For our class, we've got data in the textbook. I've got a link to those data files, and so right around week 3, we switch gears and start using the data a fair amount. You could just download the data sets that correspond to our textbook. Great. Data that I use in class to display things, I'll sort of show you there. It's all available via that link. Sometimes I'll add additional data sets and I'll build them in and re-upload for you, those new. The JMP software that I'm going to ask you to use in class, starting in class, in the asynchronous portion of class, starting today, you will download that and then install it. So if you get it done while lecture is going on, yay. If not, do that right promptly afterwards before you guys work in groups. Other things, I'm going to skip over those for the now, and I'm going to jump right into where it says Monday and Wednesday of this week. Week 1, Monday and Wednesday. Okay, finally. Here's what happened 2 years ago that corresponds to today's class. If you needed to miss today's class or you wanted a different take on things, just watch that. Later on today, after the video becomes available, I will put a link to the Zoom version of the class video. And then once I can download it and upload again to YouTube, I'll switch over to a YouTube link for today's class. Today's topic is sort of administrative trivial matters, and then chapter 1, section 1 and 1, 2. Really, chapter 1, section 2 is visual displays of univariate data. We'll talk about that. The corresponding homework problems are out of chapter 1, section 2, 1, 4, 8, and 16. These guys are due on Wednesday by midnight. Well, I guess 11:59 p.m. And then at the end of class today, you're going to be working on with other classmates a lab. If I click my way into that, it says JMP fun, histograms, blah, 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 blah. For the lab, what you'll do is as a group of 5, sometimes 4 of you, you'll download the assignment. Okay. It's in a Word doc form. I haven't switched over to Google Docs yet. I'm really thinking I'm going to by fall, but right now it's in Word doc form. Download it. You'll probably choose to upload it to Google Docs, one of you, and then you'll share the link with the others in your group. And the group of you, the 4 or 5 of you, will type out your answers, doing often screenshots of content from JMP output. And then you'll type up your reasoned and thought out and argued about answers. Save as a PDF, and then click there, start assignment, and upload it. Should be good, fun, and easy. Today, we've got data on individual members of the San Luis Obispo Fire Department, their heights and weights and stuff like that from the 1990s, basically. Okay, let's back out a little bit and get into the syllabus. You all should feel free to interrupt me as we go if you'd like. Okay, syllabus is an attempt to tell you approximately and exactly what you should expect. Some of the things are approximate, some are exact. Like the time that we're officially supposed to be here, that's exact. That's an exact link. Follow it. If you need to get hold of me, please don't call my office because it's summer term and I'm available via email more easily because I may or may not actually be to campus before the final exam, but there's no guarantee. Office hours for Zoom, you click your way into the Zoom link in the same way that if you were following this link, you'd get to class. Stuff that's important, read it. Things always important about grades. Well, there's 5 components of your grade. One of them is just do the frickin' homework. and turn it in. Mondays and Wednesdays, if there's problems assigned on Monday or Tuesday, turn it in by Wednesday. Problems assigned on Wednesday or Thursday, turn it in by the following Monday. That's easy to do, but for some students, that's the hardest part about the whole term is figuring out when to turn in homework assignments. So think Mondays and Wednesdays, turn in something by midnight. Always the Monday problems you could ask about in class on Tuesday. Always the Tuesday problems you could ask about in class on Wednesday. And so from the end of class on Wednesday, like about 5 o'clock until 11:59, that yeah, it's 7 hours ish that you have to work on the homework problems or perfect your problems, if you will. Hopefully you'll do the problems between one class session and then the next, and you could ask and then correct your answers in that little window that you have after you ask. Lab activities, those are meant to be straightforward and, yeah, an opportunity to meet a few other people in the class because you're going to be working with them. And just turn them in before the next class session, and it should be full credit. So all of you should have at least 16.67% of the points in the class. That was a joke. You should do better than that, okay? But if you like literally just show up and work on the labs, and you should all get full credit. It's only a situation where a group turns in a lab that's like half done that you get like half credit. But usually across 5 people, you're able to figure it out. There's 2 exams besides the final exam. The first one is called due July 2nd. If I look on the second page of the syllabus, it says exam one, but it doesn't say that is on July 2nd. That's like June 30th. So June 30th, July 1, July 2. Turn it in by end of day on Thursday, midnight by Thursday. So you'll have from class session Tuesday until, so that's like just over 2 full days to get it done. Same thing for the July 2, I'm sorry, exam two, which is scheduled to be due July 11. July 11 is like a Saturday, but yeah, you're going to have it released to you on Thursday, so you get until midnight Saturday to turn that in. So at least 2 days to get the exams done. The final exam is, like we said, in person, and it is 4 to 6 p.m. If for whatever reason you have something booked for 5 to 6 p.m., even though the class is 4 till 5, we scheduled at least 2-hour final exams, and I checked with a whole bunch of people, and they say, yeah, 4 to 6 is the time block that your student should be there. But if you have a 5 to 6 p.m. on that Thursday for some reason, just let me know. We'll work it out somehow, maybe by you starting earlier, 3 to 4, perhaps. Okay. So yeah, basically, you should look at the stuff from the past if you want to, but there is a bit of a warning because every year is a little bit different. If I remember 2 years ago, I was really sick, like right around day 3 of class, that I literally couldn't make it to even the Zoom class, and I just canceled everything. And so we adjusted things on the fly. And so our calendar is a little bit different than the one that we followed that term. I'm trying to, with the links to past assignments, make sure it works out, but it's always a little bit different and things always work out. So we'll be good. This is meant to be an approximate schedule. For the in-class exam, bring a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper for the front and back for the final. For the other exams, I encourage you to literally write a one-sided 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, not both sides, just one side for your midterm 1 and your midterm 2. And the reason is if you have everything you need on one reference sheet, it makes it really quick to know where to turn to. Literally, if you have the equation there, you don't have to even flip to page 812 or whatever it is in the book. I can't prevent you from using the book, and so open book. Sure, open notes. Yeah, whatever, no problem. Um, However, there is the requirement that for exams you not use the internet for any other thing. If you want to communicate with anyone about the exam, that's me. So if you send me an email, hopefully I'll get it promptly and then get back to you. But Really, do your best, reach out as need be, and just trust that things will work out. Just don't use other humans or AI, which are artificial humans. Don't do that during the course of the test. An approximate or tentative schedule is today we're doing sort of this. And then we're going to do a little bit of work with how to display data. We're going to move on to talk about some basics of probability in Tuesday, Wednesday, even Thursday. And we will have opportunities during office hours to go over those sample exam questions. And then, like I said, next Tuesday, we'll start with that first exam. It will cover material through chapters 1 and 2. It will not include material that's new on the day of the exam. Similarly, exam 2 will cover material from chapter 3, 4, 5, but not chapter 6, which we will just start on. So that's the date the exam is released. And what else? Anything else? Yeah, that's about it. You can read. I trust y'all can read. I love it, however, if there are questions in the earlier class, Stat 313, which is a second stat class for mostly biology types. They had at least 4 questions at this point in time, so I'm willing to pause. I've tried to be quick, which means I'll probably overlook something. Okay, if a minute or 5 goes by and you say, hold on, I totally had a question. Do not hesitate. Unmute. Let me know that you got a question. Oh,
Oh,
Katie,
um, I was wondering what your late work policy is.
what late work policy? Maybe I should have one, huh? Turn shit in. I'm sorry, I shouldn't swear. Turn things in on time. I do think somewhere on the syllabus it says if you turn it in late and it's too late, it's sort of a definite reduction. But oh, it says there will be if too late, it will be no credit. If it's marked down for being late, don't be surprised. What I've always told my grader in the past for the homeworks is this. If about the time you start grading a problem set, if someone hasn't turned it in, mark it down. If they turn it in before you start grading, you can mark it down, but I wouldn't encourage that. And if you finish grading a whole stack and then someone turns it in, it's late enough that you're welcome to not give it any credit at all. So usually if the grader takes a day or so before they start or finish, it means you got a little bit of wiggle room, but I would probably turn it in on time. So, Katie, I think that might not have touched on the reason for your question, but let me add one other thing. If you know of a legitimate reason, like I'm on a sport team and I'm traveling, or literally, I don't think I could turn it in, and here's why, because I'm sort of in court that day for a DUI, just let me know these things, and I can always forward the information to the grader and said, would you please be gracious in this circumstance for this reason? Um, I usually don't tend to look too carefully what the grader does, but I give them those guidances. And if you don't like what the grader does, let me know, and I can overrule them and make suggestions for the future. So, Katie, did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank
Did
you.
I answer it successfully
For now, yes.
for now? Yeah, that's good. I like that. Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah, man. Well,
In the JMP download link,
yeah.
it kind of shows us like the step by steps of like, what to do when they downloading it. Is there
Oh,
like a
yeah.
link that like directly downloads it or?
No, it's for better or worse. due to how Cal Poly has their software license set up with the SaaS corporation that does GMP, um, it might take as much as several hours for you to go through the step where you can get the link to download it and then properly install it. And so with that in mind, it's annoying. Man, it's not a direct download. We used to have that more directly, which I appreciated. And so yeah, maybe I'll change the date that the lab is due. Maybe have the first two of them due at the same time by 4 p.m. the third day of class. You should all be able to have it done by tomorrow at about this point in time. Most people will get it done within half an hour to an hour, but I have had some students where it took like a full day for them to get the software installed. So, Manuel, does that answer your question sufficiently?
Um, yeah, pretty sure.
Pretty sure. Yeah. You want to follow up though?
I just come like on the link. It says download, but I just don't directly know what I'm downloading. But
So
I'm trying to
yeah,
look at it
it's
actively.
it's sending you. Maybe I should go into close there. Bim. Yeah, if I were to describe this, it would be where's it? Download and install it. Sort of sends you to Polly's way of describing here's how to open JMP for the first time. Okay. And I'm just gonna go ahead, fine, accept that, whatever. And then darn it, gonna go through here. And yeah, it says basically you have to sort of verify that you've been authorized by your software administrator. And so what you're supposed to do is, darn it. Mhm. So yeah, after you've downloaded something, and I'm not sure where it is that you do the download, but it should be somewhere here. Maybe it's you go to JMP directly, but I know that students in the past terms have used exactly in the last two, three terms actually have used this link here, and they were able to download it with no problem and get it installed. If you find that as a challenge, let me know. You can always also um, I think I just call 67000 or 1-805-756-7000. That's the IT people on campus, or via, I guess, the portal, you can submit a ticket for help. Again, I've not had any difficulty with people in the past said they couldn't get it done within a day. So I apologize that it's not better. I get to do this every year, once a year myself, but I'm not doing it for the first time. And so it looks and feels differently to me than it will be for you. But that's the link that they told us to give to y'all. So anyone else?
Wait,
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
I think you guys could search up the JMP student edition and you should be able to do it.
Yeah, that seems, yeah, Google is a good way to do the things. And the key is using JMP Student Edition to register for it. You have to go through the process and be through the SSL. You would have to basically tell JMP that you are attached to our institution, and our institution verifies, and they get that information from Cal Poly saying you're cool. Oh, love it. So even better. Thank you, Sylvia. I want to do a link to open in browser. Hey, Sylvia suggested we look here, and this is, well, shoot. Okay, I'm gonna just go ahead and use the passcode there or whatever it is. So this, oh, this is gonna be annoying, isn't it? Okay, good, finally. Okay, so I'm okay. So yes, on Apps Anywhere, I do not recommend JMP as a virtual machine. Okay. I do believe that Apps Anywhere does have a link to JMP. So if I click that, it may allow you fine. Hmm. 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 Okay, so yeah, okay, I shouldn't say don't. In a pinch, that virtual computer lab, I know students have used it successfully, but um I would click the download via gmp.com. That's what I would suggest doing. So thank you, Sylvia. Hey, my kid's name as well. Yay, go team. Um, any other questions? Okay, so what I'd love to do is to switch gears entirely and start talking about chapter one, section one, and then we'll move into chapter one, section two. Let's see, which example do I want to use? Not that one. Mhm. Okay, so I, okay, catfish, good. So here I've got a situation. Let me describe my friend Lowell Ballard. And he's someone I met in 1993, 94, somewhere in that time frame. And Lowell Ballard went out as a graduate student at Virginia Commonwealth University, where I worked for 5 years before moving back to California into Cal Poly. He went out to the James River in Richmond, Virginia, and he collected a sample of catfish. So there's a group of individuals that I'm going to call catfish from the James River, and maybe make the line width a little bit narrower so it can read it more easily. So these catfish in the James River, let's consider characteristics of the fish, but maybe if we care about their lengths, there's a collection of lengths. And in the lengths, I'm just using to describe the individual catfish. And there's a whole group of catfish. Some of them live right near the shore. Some of them live right out in the deep water. Some live upstream from Richmond, Virginia, where he went out fishing. Some live downstream. And he just, for one summer, with DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality employees, he went out and collected catfish from the population of catfish. And he took a sample. And in theory, he took a sample of size N individuals. N is the number of catfish that he collected. Now, you would love to know characteristics about all catfish, but the problem is there's tens of or hundreds of thousands of catfish that live in the James River in that location right near Richmond, Virginia. And because there's tens of thousands of fish, you really can't see them all. You really can't. What you can do is see some of them. So he went out and collected his sample. I'm showing you inside JMP data on some of those catfish, trying to show you some of the information. And one thing is this is the date on which he caught the catfish. And I don't believe this is actually the date, like, 35/18/4. That's not an actual calendar date, but I think it's the number of days since January 1st, 1960, or it's the number of days since January 1st of the year 1901. I've forgotten which one of those it is, but it tells me what date he caught the fish. There's a species of the fish, a blue catfish in this first case. There's the length of that fish in millimeters. There's the number of items that fish had in its stomach. 0 items in the stomach. His goal was to actually see what the catfish had in their stomach, because there was the belief that some of the catfish are more likely to be eating a certain endangered species than other catfish. And so he was trying to figure out which type of catfish are most likely to be eating the endangered local critter. And so we have information about lots of content like ALOSASPP, Alosa sapidissima. That's American shad. And that's the one we want to protect. And this 10th catfish in the data set had one in its stomach, or this 15th had two in its stomach. You can't always actually tell a full catfish stomach, like everything in there, but you can say, look, sort of a skeleton, and the skeleton is the right size, and it has the right genetics to be one of these American shad. And so we can identify all the items in the stomach eventually. But yeah, information about length and species seem quite reasonable to try to describe. And when we switch gears from chapter 1, section 1, where we talk about populations versus samples, sample is literally just a subset of the population. We need to sort of describe the data in a sample. So I'm going to take a quick screenshot and then switch gears, clear that out. Okay, come on. Okay. Eventually, I will be able to clear the screenshot. I hope. Okay, no. Okay, yes, save 2 photos. Good. Okay, and now I can clear that. Cool. And where is that? Clear. I'm not seeing how I can clear the screen, so that's fine. I will do my best. I apologize for this. Okay. So I'm going to show you stuff with purple and white in the background. So maybe, actually, hold on. Here's a quick solution. Let's just go ahead and erase some of the stuff, some of the big things anyway. Okay, so in terms of our fish and the data set, if we describe characteristics of our sample, we're hopefully able to describe characteristics of the population from which we've sampled. There are three sorts of graphs that I want to talk about. One of them is, it's a bar graph. And in a bar graph, it's basically, think categorical variable. And how do we describe the categorical variable? I'm just going to count the number of occurrences of that particular value. And then I'm going to display that as along the y-axis with a bar of a height that corresponds to then the number of individuals. You can see here a little species here off to the left. It's a little red thing. The red thing is a way of describing the variable. Literally, it's a nominal variable. We'll talk later about what nominal means. You can see like length here. If I describe that as continuous, it sounds like a number. So there are number things and things that aren't numbers. Bar graph go with things that are not numbers. So species is not something that's numeric in its nature. How would I describe species with a bar graph? I'm going to go ahead and just use analyze. Analyze the distribution. Literally analyze distribution of what? Of what? The species. What are the species that I have and how often do I see each kind? And it sort of appears over sometimes in the wrong window and I drag it back into the right window. I think this is laid out in a vertical format. JMP by default will lay some of the graphs out in a vertical format. I don't love that. The more traditional way to do this would be to have it horizontal. I'm going to click this thing called stack. I'm going to turn on stack as opposed to turning it off, whereas the vertical format, I like the horizontal format, the stacked format. And what I spot here is there's more BCF or blue catfish than there are CCF or channel catfish. White catfish seems to be in third place occurrence-wise, and FCF flathead catfish is in fourth place. And you can even see a count of each 2644 of the blue catfish, channel catfish 801, white catfish 563, flathead catfish 156. What proportion? It says prob, I call that proportion. What proportion is in each category? 63%. That's the height of the bar is 63%. So we could see with this bar graph about how often we see each kind of catfish. Is that exciting? No. If you didn't have any clue about what fraction of the catfish in the James River are of each of these four major species, you might say, oh, I expect really more flathead because I see a lot of flathead when I go out. You might not, you might know there's a lot of blue and not so much of the flathead. And so you get some information from the bar graph. And the claim is this: if we sample in a fair way or a representative way, and I hope you spotted the air quotes there, if we sampled in a fair or representative way, what you would see in the sample should be reflecting the characteristics you see in the population. Like, in other words, in the James River, I'm expecting maybe half or more of the catfish would be blue catfish, and then only a small fraction, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% are flathead in the whole river, even though I've got data from just this one sample of some 4,000 catfish overall. Bar graph, categorical, a categorical variable. What's the other kind of thing? Well, what about a histogram? A histogram is basically a bar graph, but for something that's quantitative in its style. Okay, bar graph for quantitative things. We've got lengths here. These are lengths of these critters in millimeters. If I try the same sort of thing, analyze the distribution of what? Of the of the length. I'm going to drag a length over here, click OK. And again, it appears in the wrong place. And again, it sort of shows me this thing not stacked up. I want it to be stacked because I think this looks easier to read. I'm going to see, it looks like a bar graph. Notice here that you could just take the thing and you can make it bigger, make it easier to see, if you will. In my bar graph, let's even make it bigger, drag it further out. Okay, in my bar graph, I'm really seeing 0 to 50, 50 to 100, 1 to 150, 150 to 200, 200 to 250, 250 to 300, etc. They're 50 unit wide blocks, 50 unit wide bars. But it's a bar graph. Now, in each bar here, like this highest one here, look, we've sort of highlighted. I click down there and it will show me, oh, these are all fish that are in that category. So we can sort of turn on or off characteristics, individuals. Okay, I could say, well, the small ones, show me the small ones, or show me the biggest ones or the really big ones. You could turn on individuals and we can simply where's this? Clear row states. If I clear row states, it basically says none of them are highlighted anymore. So in my histogram, I get a sense for the largest catfish by length is really unusually large compared to, in some sense, whatever the typical catfish length is. I'm thinking the typical here is like 300 or so. 1,200 is a lot larger than 300 than the smallest is, like 50, compared to 300. So only a small difference between the middling one and then the lowest one, but a large difference between the middling one and the biggest. It looks as though the data are stretched out, if you will, stretched out further to the right than to the left of that centering value. I would call these data skew right. Our book might say positively skewed distribution. I'll just say skew right distribution. Actually, that does raise a good joke. Jay DeVore, the guy who wrote the book and lives up the hill from me, a student wrote when describing a distribution on a midterm exam. He wrote, "This is a positively screwed distribution." SCREWED. Student partially remembered the term. Jay gave partial credit to that answer, even though it was positively skewed, but he did write a snotty comment like, "No, but your grade is." I thought that was rude. Moving on. I'm going to say that if your data stretch out further to the right than to the left of the centering value, you'd say it's skewed right. If it is, however, on the other hand, sort of like that pattern, you'd say skewed to the left. There's even symmetrical distributions. And in a symmetrical distribution, you'd say, well, on either side of some sort of axis of symmetry, it looks approximately the same. Now, in mathematics, if you say symmetrical, you mean perfectly symmetrical. In statistics, we say approximately symmetrical. And you'd think that, yeah, clearly the same on the right and the left, but you can have distributions like that that are approximately symmetrical, but there's two separate peaks, two modes, if you will, a bimodal distribution. So the mode is the peak, if you will, and two modes, two peaks, they could be symmetrical, or it could be bimodal and skewed to the right. Stretches out further to the right than to the left of that central value. Again, not really defining central very precisely, but we'll do that in a later chapter. So distributions, yay, they're fun. Histogram, check. It is a bar graph for a quantitative variable. The third thing that I wanted you to see is a stem and leaf diagram. A stem and leaf diagram dates back to when we had ASCII graphics. So you might not remember this because you're probably younger than me. I remember this because I lived through the 1970s and 80s. And if you had a computer and all you had was characters like numbers and letters to make pictures with, all the keys on your keyboard, and that's it, you might very well say, I would love to do something like a histogram, but I would like to do it more fancy than that. I could do what I call a stem and leaf diagram. Let me just show you a stem and leaf diagram for the number of cylinders, and then I'll do it for displacement. This is data on actually, I'll try it for MPG. Cylinders and then MPG. So this is for a variety of different cars. The number of cylinders, it looks as though we got 4, 6, and 8. 5. Okay, don't get that one, but we got 4, 5, 6, and 8 cylinders. If I just showed you analyze the distribution of what? Of the number of cylinders, click OK. Again, it appears in the awkward and wrong place here. Man, I don't like it. That vertical thing, stack it up, please. We do see, yes, 4 mostly, 5 every so often, 6, and then 8 cylinders. Huh, there's something interesting here. Let's draw your attention to the interesting thing. Do y'all spot that the distance from 4 to 5, it's what's shaded in? But the number of cylinders is not really ever 4.3. It seems as though we're using what is sometimes termed the right point convention. The right point convention, the endpoint convention. If there's a value in a histogram that's right on the boundary, like from 4 to 4.99999, 5 to 5.9999, if it's right on the boundary, it's in the bar to the right, not in the bar to the left. If there's a 7-cylinder car, it would be showing right here. No, there are no 7-cylinder cars. If there's an 8-cylinder car, it would be in the range 8 to 9 is where we show that. So if you're right on the boundary, and that matters for variables which take integer values, if you cut right at the integer, then you're going to show it that way. So we've got our figure here. It's happy, it's fun. We haven't shown you a stem and leaf diagram. This is sort of like a bar graph or like a histogram. In any case, how do we turn on the stem and leaf diagram? In the lab, it talks you through these little things called, I call it JMP's little red arrow, little red option selector. Under where it says cylinders, I click down and I can turn things on and off. Stem and leaf, that's one of the things I want to turn on. It tells me here there are, well, 4 with a vertical bar 0, like 4 and a 0 here. That's like a 4.0. So that's a 4 cylinders, 4 cylinders, 4. There's 19 observations that are exactly 4 cylinders. There's 5 observations that are exactly one observation that's exactly 5 cylinders. 10 of the cars are 6 cylinders. 8 are 8 cylinders. So we can tell from this stem and leaf diagram, these ASCII graphics, how many cars are of each different size cylinder-wise. Okay, what I said we would try for miles per gallon, let's try that. Analyze the distribution of what? MPG, boom. Click that, okay. And again, it appears in the wrong place. And it's, again, vertical. I don't like the vertical. I'm going to stack it because I like to stack it. Okay, so it seems as though some of the cars have a very low miles per gallon, barely over 15. Others get as high as like 40, 35 to 40. Not too bad. Not too bad. Okay, so what could we do? We could under the miles per gallon, we can, under display options, change various things. But we said we're going to turn on the stem and leaf diagram. And the stem and leaf diagram tells an awful lot of information about the miles per gallon. Literally, from 16 to 17, there's 6 cars that are in that range, 16 to 17. Now we rounded a little bit to get 16 to 17. Like that 15.5 right here. 15.5. Where does that occur? It's down here. It is this observation that was rounded to 16. Yeah, literally, we're rounding a little bit until we have some sort of major level of variability. The front digit's going to be beginning with 1 or a 2 or a 3 if it's 16 or 20 or 32. So the stem digits correspond to the first digit. The leaf digits are where we see some variability within that stem. So 16s and 17s, 18s and 19s, 20 and 21s, 22s and 23s. And there are no 23s. 24s and 25s, there are no 24s or 25s. 26 and 7s, there's only 27s. 28 and 29, there's 3 of them in total. 2 are 28 and 1 is 29. 37 is the highest miles per gallon, and 16 is the lowest once we've rounded it. The stem and leaf diagram is pretty darn cool because it tells us what we absolutely need. Stem and leaf diagram, though, maybe not as useful as a histogram. If we had thousands of data points, let's go back to our earlier catfish example. If I turned on, let's try the lengths again. Analyze the distribution of the lengths of the catfish. Boom. And again, it appears over here. Let's, nope, not that, right there. This little red triangle. Turn on our stem and leaf diagram. Oh, I'm thinking that's not so helpful, is it? It's actually particularly unhelpful. This stem, yes, it does have 1,305 individuals in it. But by the time we get it off to the left, I'm not sure if it's the things that begin with 200 or 300. I'm just saying fewer data points, stem and leaf is a great way to try and quickly summarize with the typewriter. Now, I'm not saying you should use a typewriter. I am saying you will find from time to time people who will show you stem and leaf diagrams. Being able to read them, it's a good thing. Okay, so now's where I say, I think I've said everything I need to today. I could be wrong. If you have any questions, let me know while I get ready to point you the next direction, the direction for the lab. Okay, so let's get over here back to the lab. If I clicked my way into week 1, or maybe just the first lab activity, 1A corresponds to week 1, Monday. You're going to, as a group, individuals will probably download this so you can work along as you go, the slow fire department data. And you're going to open this data assignment and you're going to sort of download it and start typing your answers. Again, this is a not an editable version right here, but you have to download it to be able to edit this. But basically, I'm saying, you know what? There's information. Look at the data and start answering these questions. Maybe hit a carriage return and start typing your answer there. Sometimes you'll want to give a cut and paste, a screenshot into the lab document for you to refer to or your group mates to refer to as you go. And let me get out of here and show you the firefighter data. These are data that were collected by a colleague of mine, or actually a pair of colleagues of mine in kinesiology, a long, long time ago in the years approximately 1990s. Okay. You could see the year in which the observation was collected in 2000.5147. That seems like a weird year, partway through the year 2000. But we got information on the age of a firefighter, the weight that they were, their height, their BMI, body mass index, is their weight in kilograms divided by height squared or something like that, percent body fat as measured in one of those fatometers, the grip strength, the number of sit-ups, push-ups, etc. that you could do, and eventually we have information on their systolic and diastolic blood pressure at rest. Okay, so you got data on a collection of firefighters and you got some questions. I'm going to hang here for a few minutes while you come up with questions that you have, but otherwise I'm going to just say the people tells you who's in who's for the lab. So, for example, if you click your way into groups, you could say, I want to find me. And if you know who you are, maybe you'll be able to spot him pretty quickly. But group W1 is Christina, Danny, Riley, and Zara. Okay, and you could find yourself and you can find your group mates and get with them, work it out, figure it out. It should be good. And I'm going to hang here. And if y'all type information into the chat for others in your group to get to, or your own phone number for texting or anything like that, that's absolutely fine. Or if you need help for me to interact with, get hold of your group mates, let me know. Otherwise, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to shut it down and wave goodbye. Yeehaw.
Do the groups change every week?
Yeah, I think they will for sure have to change. By the end of this week, a couple of you will have dropped, and then a couple others may be formally added to the class. And so from week 1 to 2, the groups will change. I want to sort of stick with it as much as possible, but if there's one group that drops below 3 people this week, I will take a volunteer to add to that group so that way they don't drop below a group count of 3. And then week 2, with summer classes, y'all tend to be pretty good about signing up for groups yourself. And so what I'll be doing is probably saying, okay, fill out this form, Google Forms. Do you want to stick with the current people you're in? Good. Sign up for your own group. I'll let you sign up for them. But if there are students who are like, yeah, I don't really necessarily vibe with those, I would rather be in with someone else, I will be willing to assign you if you say that you want that right around the end of week 1, beginning week 2. I might be helpful with that. But you're welcome to stick with the group if that's a group that you like.
Sorry, I was having some Wi-Fi troubles in the new place at the beginning of the meeting. Where can I go on the canvas to find the download for JBL?
Yeah, click into the very front and it's a JMP.
James?
So if it says download JMP software, but also one student suggested go to the software hub and software.calpoly.edu, then type JMP, and that should work. Very helpful. Don't use the virtual computer lab, but rather the download via jmp.com.
Gotcha. Thanks. And then how do you recommend we
Mhm.
contact our teammates? Is that through Canvas you recommend?
Inside Canvas, and where it says people, you should please feel free to sort of like where it says groups, find your own name, and then what you do is you find, well, the name of the other students. And if I remember in my earlier class and 2 summers ago, students were like, oh, yeah, I know how to reach those other individuals. For example, if you need to reach Brian, I don't know how you can do that. But y'all are clever people and y'all worked it out 2 years ago. I'm assuming you still can. If you need help with me, help from me to reach out to them. Like if in 10 minutes, any of you haven't been able to reach any of your group mates, let me know. I could get you their email addresses.
Gotcha.
Yeah, life's good. It always works out. Sometimes you have to ask a question, though. So I'm glad you asked the question. This is actually probably not so exciting, though. So I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording because none of you need this part to be recorded.